Thank you. My message today is on the subject, Queen Esther's real identity. Queen Esther's real identity. There have been quite a number of sermons and articles on the subject of the book of Esther through the years, arguing the point of whether the book of Esther belongs in our scriptural canon in the Bible or not. And I won't waste your time tap dancing around the issue only to conclude at the end that you'll have to make up your own mind. I will be very direct. Yes, there is indeed a historical basis for the book of Esther, as I will show. So let's first start with some needed historical background. The Jewish Encyclopedia, under the article Shushan, which is in Greek Susa, Hebrew and Assyrian is Shushan, and Elamitic is Shushin. It was the ancient capital of Susiana of Elam and the winter palace of the kings of Persia. The city was a very ancient one and is mentioned under the name of Sis or Sissa in Babylonian inscriptions as early as 2400 BC. In 640 BC, during the reign of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, or his name in Assyrian was Ashurbanipali, Shushan came under Babylonian control, but it was captured by the Persians under Cyrus the Great, who reigned from 550 to 530 BC, who made it his seat of government. The circumference of Shushan during its prime seems to have been about 6 or 7 miles, which is quite extensive for a city in those early times. And on the right bank of the Ulai River stood a temple or observatory whose remains are now called Stelae Suleiman, or the Hill of Solomon, and other structures. The ruins of the Persian palace were excavated by Williams and Loftus, and more recently by Delafloy and his wife, covering about 300 acres on 3 platforms. Wow. Quite a large building, 300-acre building. To the southwest are the remains of a semicircular citadel, and across a ravine to the north is a platform containing the ruins of the Hall of Audience, or throne room, while a long terrace to the east was the site of the palace and the harem. Unquote from the Jewish Encyclopedia. In the Bible, Susa or Shushan is mentioned once in Nehemiah, chapter 1, verse 1, once in Daniel, chapter 8, verse 2, while the scene of the book of Esther is laid in the city in several chapters. Chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, and 9. Yes, the book of Esther has a definite historical basis. There was a Persian Empire. There was a substantial city called Susa or Shushan, and there were exiled Israelites there. Yet that is not the real issue. The actual question to address is whether the book of Esther was tampered or not. Has it been tampered since it was first written? And my answer again is a definite yes. That should be quite apparent since according to Hebrew scholar Dr. Elise Stern, there are, she says, quote, at least 5 versions from antiquity. The Hebrew version that made it into the Hebrew Bible, 2 Greek versions, 2 Aramaic versions, unquote. In addition to all of those, the Jewish Talmud has its own interpretation of the events of the book of Esther, which, believe it or not, has Persian Queen Vashti not only persecuting the Jews, but she grew a tail like the devil and had 103 pimples. According to a popular Jewish children's song sung during Purim, which was last Saturday. Ignoring the last rather silly account, which of the 5 main versions came first, Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek? Scholars are not sure. Dr. Stern says, quote, scholarly opinions differ on the relationship of these versions to one another. Some assert that the Greek versions are translations of Hebrew versions that either predated or were contemporaneous of the version that eventually became part of the Hebrew Bible, unquote. So in other words, the book of Esther in our present Bibles may not be the original version that was written. It may be a tampered version that came later. They don't know. Jewish scholar David Frankel, in fact, asserts this, saying, quote, according to the analysis of several scholars, the Greek version of Esther, known as the Alpha text, that's what they called the Greek version, the Alpha text, because many believe it came first, reflects the version of the Esther story that predates our Protestant Bible's Masoretic version. Significantly, the original version of this Alpha text did not apparently include the founding of an annual festival, unquote. This means that the Jewish festival of Purim was not in the original text of the book of Esther and was added by a later editor in order to give justification for this popular Jewish holiday. Frankel adds, quote, the very long account of the war and the establishment of Purim in chapter 9 must be entirely supplementary. Those are the chapters that give the basis of Purim. He goes on and says, the secondary nature of this material explains the origins of the suspicious doublet regarding merriment and celebration, unquote. One more remark by Frankel is important. As noted by others, he says, Esther, chapters 9 and 10, display a marked drop in the quality of the writing. While the narrative of Esther 1 through 8 is mostly clear, well-structured, and highly suspenseful, the discourse about the festival is choppy, repetitive, and tedious, unquote. So yes, the two chapters supporting the Purim festival of modern Judaism are entirely spurious, added later to the text. And as Christians, we do not need to keep the Purim holiday. To be honest, Purim is really not a biblical religious holiday at all, but a comical party day to be silly and drunk. With similar aspects to Mardi Gras, Halloween, the Indian festival of Holi, and the medieval European Feast of Fools. In fact, there are 9 drinking banquets in the story of Esther. 9 drunken feasts in one short tale. No wonder there's so much liquor flowing during Purim. None of this kind of stuff was in apparently the original version of the story, as I will explain. Bible commentators have not been kind to the Hebrew version of Purim found in our Protestant Bibles. Biblical scholar John Edgar McFadden, professor of Bible at Knox College, wrote in his book, Introduction to the Old Testament, that Esther was characterized by, quote, aggressive fanaticism and fierce hatred of all that lay outside Judaism, unquote. He added that the book's popularity was due primarily, quote, to the power with which it expresses some of the most characteristic, if almost odious, traits of Judaism, unquote. Martin Luther, the German reformer, stated, quote, I am so hostile to this book that I wish that it did not exist, for it Judaizes too much and has too much heathen naughtiness, end of quote. The respected International Critical Commentary, a major Christian Bible commentary, says, quote, there is not one noble character in this book. Esther, for the chance of winning wealth and power, takes her place in the herd of maidens to become concubines of the king. She conceals her origin, is relentless toward a fallen enemy. Mordecai sacrifices his cousin to advance his interests, advises her to conceal her religion, displays a wanton insolence in his refusal to bow down to Haman. All this the author narrates with interest and approval. Morally, Esther falls below the general level of the Old Testament, even the Apocrypha. It is never quoted by Christ, nor any of the New Testament writers. The early Christian church made no use of it. Its insignificant contrast stands the high esteem of the book given in later Judaism, unquote, from the International Christian Commentary published by Scribner's Sons, page 96. In this message, I want to give you solid scholarly evidence underlying what is in fact the original long-forgotten story now called the Book of Esther, free from the silliness and drunkenness that found itself in our current version. Some of you may already be somewhat familiar with the basic story of Esther if you watched either of the two fairly recent Christian movies telling the story. In the movie titled Esther, which came out in the year 2000, the film director chose a beautiful British young lady with very pretty deep blue eyes to play the heroine. One could easily imagine her winning a beauty contest anywhere. But this unleashed, of course, a torrent of negative disparagement from the woke crowd, who insisted that Esther had to have been a brown lady, and were horrified of the depiction of her as white. Such racial animosity these days. So they immediately raised the money to produce and hurriedly promote a second motion picture to replace it that came out just 9 years later. This one was called One Night with the King. It would have been more truthful to title it The Rape by the King. That's really what it was, but the politically correct redone movie glorified this horrible act as if it was simply wonderful. Their depiction of an underage rape was so romantic and sweet, it nearly made me ill watching it. Very sad. The film One Night with the King actually glorified forced rape as if it were something wonderfully romantic and something to celebrate. One night with the king. Isn't that wonderful? The truth of the situation is far different than the rosy picture presented by the modernist evangelical community. One Mideast scholar, Professor Groves, tells us, quote, "The end of Esther 2, verse 14, seems to me to recount a tragedy. Girls were rounded up and deflowered by the king for his pleasure and his vanity, probably by the hundreds, according to Phipps' estimate, as cited by Weiler in 1995. And then they would linger forgotten in the harem for the rest of their lives. The king's sexual indulgence represented a theft of sorts, which affected the girls' families even to future generations," unquote. The hundreds of girls that were not chosen to be queen were not allowed to return to their families, but became a permanent part of the king's harem, his play toys. This film found a new heroine, the new film found a new heroine with the requisite politically correct dark complexion, presenting what was to me actually a rather run-of-the-mill Egyptian-looking lady, not someone who looked at all able to win an empire-wide beauty contest. To just briefly address the sensitive racial issue, let me point out that the ancient Persians were of the Indo-European white race. That is an established historical fact. The same racial type as the Indo-European Anglo-Saxons of Europe and the British Isles. In fact, historian Sharon Turner said that there were hundreds of Persian words in the early Anglo-Saxon language. This points up the fact that historians trace the Anglo-Saxons' origin to the Mideast in the region of Medo-Persia, the exact same place where Hebrews of the lost 10 tribes of the northern house of Israel, called Ephraim, were exiled to and then lost to history. lost track of them. But the language connection shows that these lost Israelites turned up in Europe, where they spoke the Indo-European language, like in Persia. The relevant point is that the book of Esther says several times, such as in chapter 2, verse 20, and other places, that Esther and her cousin Mordecai successfully hid their Jewish identity and easily passed for Persians. Could they have hid their Jewish heritage in ancient Indo-European Persia if they were brown-skinned and Egyptian-looking? Obviously not. Even today, the standard Jewish type matches white Caucasians or Indo-Europeans. Yet a fairly large church advertisement last month in Metro Times, a Detroit City newspaper, declared, quote, "The Bible is a black book," unquote. The woke crowd now claims that the Israelites were black, Jesus was black, and they have their own Afrocentric Bible, which I examined and found that it racially disparages anyone with white skin. But this book is available on Christian bookstore shelves without a whimper of disagreement. Having now given our movie review, we can now discuss the Esther story's ties to early Israel history. Why has the story of Esther remained so popular? And why was it included in our biblical canon? Jewish historian Mark Zvi Bretler says, quote, "The Hebrew scroll of Esther is full of political intrigue set in the Persian court, attempted assassinations, private and public parties, bribes to further particular interests, and of course conflicts between major players with their own agendas, most especially Mordecai and Haman," unquote. And this brings up an important and often ignored background to the story, with links to Edom and Amalek in biblical history. We read in Esther 3:6, "But he, Haman, disdained," Hebrew word bazah, Strong's 959, "to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to do away with all Jews, Mordecai's people, throughout the kingdom of Ahasuerus." Unquote. The term disdained is the same verb used when Esau sold his birthright to Jacob in Genesis 25, verse 34. Thus did Esau disdain, bazah, his birthright. Are we being given a hint that there is an ancestral story link between Esau and Mordecai? Rabbinic literature has long declared Esther the descendant of King Saul and Haman the descendant of Esau, and there is biblical justification for this. It is no accident that Esther and Mordecai are of the biblical tribe of Benjamin. Mordecai, in Esther 2:5, is identified as the direct descendant of Benjaminite King Saul's son, Kish. The book of Esther is actually documenting an ongoing ancestral battle with King Saul's descendants, Esther and Mordecai, set against Esau's line of descent, including his grandson Amalek and later descendant Haman. Agag was a dynastic term for each of the kings of the Amalekites. Jewish historian Professor Sarah Japhet says, quote, "The book of Esther is an ancient Jewish novel which follows the contours of Persian court tales. It has an intricate plot with dual heroes, Mordecai and Esther, standing up against the villainous Haman. These two motifs or plot lines, the court story and the harem story, are quite common in the Oriental Romance tradition. The two plots are combined very effectively, however, by making two protagonists, Esther and Mordecai, cousins, and by placing the Mordecai versus Haman account in a Jewish context. The new context is enhanced, perhaps in an even later reduction, by making Mordecai a Benjaminite from the family of Saul, while Haman becomes an Amalekite from the family of the last king of Amalek, Agag, unquote. As background, Haman is called an Agagite in Esther 3, verse 1, a descendant of King Agag. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul leads a successful campaign against the Amalekites, but disobeying the prophet Samuel does not destroy them, sparing Agag's life and saving the rest of the booty. As a result, God takes the kingship from Saul's house. In the book of Esther, the tables are turned, and King Saul's descendants finally complete the divine command to destroy Agag's descendants. But there is more to the forgotten original story. The historicity of the present book is curiously flawed. As an example, we read in Esther 2, verses 5 to 7, "Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter." Now, the fall of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar took place in 586 BC. Exactly 100 years later, in 486 BC, Ahasuerus or Xerxes took the throne. The book of Esther places her queenship 3 years later, which would be 483 BC, making Esther at least 103 years old when she was selected to be the prettiest young maiden in the empire.
Wow. She must have been quite
The historic account in this book has been tampered with. What happened? Why the historical corruption? Well, other examples can be given. Persian history obtained by archaeologists from clay cylinders have documented all of the Persian kings in its 120-year history, and there was never a Queen Vashti, or a Queen Esther, or a Queen Hadassah. There were never 127 provinces in the Persian Empire, something like a couple dozen. Something is not right here. The answer is found in the underlying language of the text. The word Purim itself is not Persian, nor is it Hebrew. It is from the Assyrian word pur, meaning lots. In ancient Assyria, lots were cast as part of a ceremony for the new year. There are a multitude of Assyrian words in the book of Esther, yet Assyria fell over 1¼ centuries before, in 614 BC, and the Assyrian language quickly became extinct at that point. In one of the most famous scenes in the book, King Ahasuerus angrily storms out of the room into the garden. You would certainly think that a garden in Persia would be called a paradisos, the Persian word from which we get our word paradise. But it is instead the Assyrian word for garden. Isn't that curious? Sidney White Crawford, in her book Esther and Judith, Contrast in Character, tells us that the setting of the book of Esther in the time of King Xerxes, who reigned 486 to 465 BC, in fact contradicts what we know of the reign of the historical Xerxes. His queen was one Amastris throughout his reign. The fictional nature of Judith, that's another apocryphal book, is much more apparent, since that book begins with a whopping historical blunder identifying Nebuchadnezzar as the king of the Assyrians, ruling from Nineveh. The ancient Persian tablets have been found and translated and show that there was no Queen Vashti in Persian history, nor in Esther. that Amestris was queen throughout the reign of Xerxes is now a proven established fact from Persian royal cuneiform documents. No, Amestris, not Esther or Hadassah. During the Persian era, it was popular for authors to write fictional romances based upon actual historical events. We see that in the apocryphal books of Susanna, Judith, and Tobit. They're all historical romances. A few years ago, out of curiosity, I did an online search on Amazon of Christian romance novels. I was amazed to find that not only were there hundreds of Christian romance novels for sale, but the great majority of them were Amish romance novels. With women today increasingly asserting themselves and women's rights a hot topic, it surprised me that modern ladies like to read romantic stories of old-fashioned, rather domesticated women. So I got up from my computer to go ask my wife about this for her opinion. I found her in the family room reading. Yes, reading an Amish romance novel. I kid you not. I almost couldn't believe it. My wife is an accomplished lady with 3 degrees, all with highest honors, but she enjoys Amish romance novels. Just look at a copy of Christian Book Distributors catalog, which I have one right here, to see what I mean. There are so many Amish romance novels in their catalog. I suppose Amish stories are perhaps a stress reliever for modern women who sometimes can feel that they are under a lot of modern pressures today to succeed and become high achievers. Romance novels, loosely based on actual historical events, were popular in biblical times, and the same is still true today. A majority of Christian books sold at present are historical romances. That is what the book of Esther was intended to be, a loosely historical-based account, not word-for-word actual history. I'm not denying that there is an underlying historical basis. But again, note that in Esther 2:6, we're told that Esther and Mordecai were part of the Jewish exile from Jerusalem in 587 BC, which would make Esther somewhere over a century old when Xerxes came to the throne. Yet we're told that she was selected from among the young virgins in the Persian Empire. It is obvious that this story is a romantic tale, a loosely historical-based novel, not an actual historical account with word-for-word quotes by the protagonists and villains. Few are aware that there are several different versions of the book of Esther besides the version in our King James Bible. Esther was transformed into a much more religious person in the Septuagint, the Greek Septuagint translation, whose enhancement of her religiosity allowed the Council of Trent to canonize her book and to cite her as a fitting role model for Christian women, according to historian Dr. Judith Newlander in her book, page 182. Yet that was not the version found today in our Protestant Bibles. The Roman Catholic Council of Trent met between 1545 and 1563 in Trento, Italy, to counter the Protestant Reformation. The book of Esther, thus, was not included in the biblical canon until the late Middle Ages. And it was a much different and more religious Greek version, not the Masoretic, authorized King James Version that was approved later for canonization. So in the early church, through many centuries, the book of Esther was not part of the biblical canon. Not until the late Middle Ages. The Hebrew version of Esther is often dated by scholars to about 150 BC, and the final Greek version, the final one, about 50 years later, about 100 BC, per Newlander in his book on page 179. If this were so, It was written many centuries after the events it describes. However, another possibility, as we will now see, is that it was revised by a later editor centuries after it was first composed. A fascinating answer has been proposed and amply documented by British professor Stephanie Daly in her book, Esther's Revenge at Susa, published by Oxford University Press in 2007, which I read at the British Library. She states, the Hebrew book of Esther contains more Akkadian and Aramaic loanwords in proportion to its length than any other book in the Hebrew Bible. And in a few cases, we can show that they fell out of use before the Persian period, unquote, from page 165. Was the book of Esther actually first written in Assyria in the 8th century, before the later exile of the 2 tribes of the house of Judah in the 6th century? Was it actually originally a story relating to the earlier exile of the 10-tribe house of Israel to Nineveh and the cities of the Medes, including Susa? Dr. Daly presents some interesting facts to establish this surprising suggestion. She adds, between 612 BC and the Persian occupation, therefore, came at least 72 years during which Assyrian was no longer used in Babylonia and Persian had not yet become current. A text that combines Assyrian and Persian vocabulary must have been revised at least once, allowing Persian words to enter into an earlier text, unquote. The title of the book itself, as I mentioned, is neither Hebrew nor Persian nor but pure Assyrian. The word lot is puru in Assyrian, isku in Persian, and goral in Hebrew. The Assyrian word puru simply had the plural ending im, added to it to form the word Purim. Notice the helpful explanation given us in Esther 3 verse 7 and Esther 9 verse 24. Quote, they cast the pur, that is, the goral or lot, unquote. Goral was the common familiar Hebrew word for lot. The game of casting lots itself is not of Hebrew origin, but was a part of the Assyrian Akitu New Year festival. The name Esther is derived from the Assyrian word Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. Ishtar was not Persian. Esther was not Persian. It is often mistakenly assumed that Esther's secondary name, Hadassah, is a Hebrew word for myrtle. Actually, it is derived from the Assyrian Hadassatu, a bride for a deity. The Hebrew word for myrtle is hidas, and Dr. Daly states, quote, there are no Hebrew noun formations comparable with Hadassah as a feminine noun form linked to hidas, unquote. So no, Hadassah does not mean myrtle. The name Vashti is derived from the Assyrian Bashti, meaning dignity, and was used as an Assyrian feminine personal noun. The name Mordecai has long been recognized as derived from Marduk, a god of Babylon who was also worshipped by the Assyrians. The name Haman is derived from Hamban, a god of the late Assyrian period. So Haman wasn't a Persian either. It's an Assyrian name. There are many Assyrian words and phrases sprinkled throughout the book of Esther, such as Bitan, a pavilion, Bira, a fort, Sharbit, a scepter. That's Esther 4 verse 11, 5 verse 2, and 8 verse 4. Keter, a crown, Pahat, for a high official, instead of the Persian word satrap. In Esther 7:7, the king stalked off to his garden using the Assyrian word yana. The Persian word paradisos, from which we get the word paradise, as I mentioned, was not used. The use of the Assyrian month names in the book of Esther instead of Hebrew or Persian. is a direct connection. In Esther 3, verse 8, Adar is stated to be the end of the year, which matches the Assyrian calendar, not that of Elamite Susa, where it was the first month of the year. Scholars have also determined that the dates of the pagan holidays in the book of Esther do not match up with the now known Persian holy days, but instead perfectly match with Assyrian holy days. That's from Professor Dolly's book, pages 146, 168, 169, and 190. The book of Esther is the story of a Hebrew girl who marries a pagan king. This could not have happened in Persia, whose laws required the king to only marry from within the Persian royal families. However, it did happen in Assyria more than once. The Assyrian tablets recorded that King Sargon II, who deported the house of Israel in 721 BC, married a Hebrew Ephraimite girl of the 10-tribe house of Israel named Athaliah or Atalia. But she was not the same person as the daughter of King Omri in 2 Chronicles chapter 22. In addition, Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III, or Pul, 2 Kings 15 verse 19, who exiled the Israelite Transjordan tribes in 732 BC, married a woman named Yaba, who bears a West Semitic name, probably Hebrew. According to the book Prosophy of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which I have in my library, published in Helsinki in 2002. Jewish scholar Dr. Ezekiel Kaufman says, quote, "From cuneiform writings we know that some of the important officials in the kingdom of Assyria were Israelites," unquote. From his book, The Babylonian Captivity in Deutero-Isaiah, page 9. In fact, it is now known that Hezekiah, king of Judah, was related to Assyrian king Sennacherib, who attacked Jerusalem in 701 BC. Two of Hezekiah's daughters married into the Assyrian royal family, as documented by historian Stephanie Daly on page 94. The weight of evidence leads to the supposition that the book of Esther was originally a religious novel with a loosely based historical framework written by a member of the 10 tribes taken in the Assyrian exile. After the 10 tribes disappeared from history, Judean priests appropriated and revised it into a story of the Babylonian exile of Judah. However, the Judean exile was to the city of Babylon and vicinity. It was instead the house of Israel that was exiled to northern Assyria and the cities of the Medes in Persia. 2 Kings 17, verse 6. Dr. Lawrence Garrity of Andrews University here in Michigan stated in his book, The Word Shall Go Forth, 1982, page 546, he says, "There is no evidence for a bona fide Persian period occupation by Jewish exiles." He said, Dr. Stephanie Daly says, the deportees who came into Assyria in the time of Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib were taken from northern Israel, the 10 tribes, from Samaria, and not from Judah. They were not Jews. They were settled in various parts of the Assyrian homeland. All of them had reason to call the festival by an Assyrian word and to relate it to a story that was linked to the cultic calendar of Ishtar of Nineveh, unquote, from her book, page 189. As a final note, the Jewish Encyclopedia says, the Babylonian schools of the Amoraic period cite the two cities of Shush and Shushri, compare Hebrew name Shushan, were among the places to which the 10 tribes were exiled, according to the Talmud in Sanhedrin 94a. Still quoting the Jewish Encyclopedia, curiously enough, both these names are given to Susa, although it is uncertain whether the Talmud refers to two separate localities at or near the ancient Susa, unquote. So according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, there was no Jewish exile to Susa. There was, of the 10 tribes, to Susa as well as to Nineveh, according to 2 Kings 17, verse 6. So this is primary evidence that it was actually the 10 tribes, not Judah, that were exiled to Susa, and was therefore a part of the Assyrian conquest of 721 BC, not the later Judean exile of 586 BC, a century and a quarter later. There is no evidence of a later Babylonian exile of Judah to Susa at all. Queen Esther was actually a Jewish revision of a story of an Ephraimite House of Israel girl named Athaliah or Atalia, who in exile did marry, historical fact, did marry Assyrian King Sargon. That is actual history, verified by the Royal Assyrian cuneiform tablets. And that is Queen Esther or Athaliah's real historic identity.